Welcome to everyone, and I am Sai Al-Hur, and I am here with Alexis Lewis. How are you, Alexis?
Doing well.
Wonderful. So glad to have you here with us today. We're going to have a great conversation here with Alexis in a few minutes, definitively connected to the Rethinking Women's Leadership in Business event that's happening in May. This is in collaboration, of course, with the Women Business Collaborative, as well as Andy Simon. And we are really talking about rethinking what's possible. So, kind of given all of that and where the world is unfolded and continues to unfold, Alexis, we have the great honor in being with you, and I would love for you to introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. I'm Alexis Lewis. You probably don't know me, but I was at one point a fairly prolific science fair and invention fair contestant. I think I placed in the finals of or won 7 national and international science fairs or invention fairs. I have 1 patent, 1 pending, both from a long time ago at this point. And I have I've taken a bit of a break from it, but now I'm hoping I'm back, or I'm working on getting back to it. But I used to give a lot of talks, TED talks and stuff like that, or TEDx. So yeah, that's basically me.
Wonderful, wonderful. I definitely think you do yourself an injustice, my good friend. So I think you are an up and coming leader that the world needs to hear your voice today and in the future. So
I don't
definitively,
like inflating my head too much,
I hear you.
Clouds
So
perception.
so you'll give me the honor of doing it then. We'll put it that way.
If you want, go ahead.
There we go. So what I'm going to do is, Alexis, I'm going to let you kind of just sort of share your perspective, and then we'll dive in. And we're all ears, my good friend, and listening to what you have to offer.
All right. So, you, the audience, have probably heard the usual feminist talking points before. It's a movement that's been around for over a century now, right? So it's a mature movement, and the audience here, you guys, are the kind of people who come to summits on women in business. So probably you've heard it before. So I'd be preaching to the choir, and generally preaching to the choir is fairly ineffective. Now, ensuring that the choir is well educated, that's important, but so yes, education is important, and I think a lot of the other speakers in this will probably help out with that. But all I would probably do is preach. So I'm going to talk about an adjacent but very much related matter. So also on the note of choirs, you, the choir, or rather everybody who is basically pro-feminist, believes that women should be treated equally. The best thing you can do is try to inform others who don't have a set opinion or have an opinion that could be changed, rather than just talking to each other. And that's probably something you've thought about, but it's always good to remember that. Habits are important. So what am I going to talk about here? Well, I'm going to talk about something important: selection bias. If you go to a knitting club, most members are people who knit, right? You won't find anybody who doesn't, more than likely. It's more or less a requirement, and the people who are there are motivated to be there because they like knitting. Similarly, those in positions of power tend to be the sort of people who seek out power in the first place, right? They have one or another motivations to gain power. It's something they want. And people in positions of power are the kind of people who have the skill set, the traits required to attain the power. That's sort of like just being someone who knits in the knitting club analogy, right? So the people, positions of power, select for those who want power in the first place and are willing to do whatever is required to attain it. And this may mean sometimes crossing moral thresholds, right? And I think most of you probably recognize that. It's fairly well recognized in our culture at this point that in small cases, but as a general statistical thing. So that said, women aren't immune, right? If we select 100 people completely at random, we'll go back to the knitting analogy, most of them won't knit, right? It's a fairly niche trait. But those who are selected from knitting clubs will, almost all of them will, maybe all of them will, right? Similarly, in a population that is mostly good people with strong empathy, if you select those who have positions of significant power, they are much less likely to be average, right? They are much less likely to be, in the case of selecting for power, and selecting for other traits won't necessarily give the same result, but selecting for people in positions of significant power, you're much less likely to find people who are average in traits that are correlated negatively or positively with the ability to attain power, right? So perhaps if we agree that it can help to attain certain types of positions of power, to have less empathy, and maybe just to be generally not quite as good a person, you're going to find people who are not within the sort of average range of that group in those traits. Now, that might it might be a little bit upsetting to think about that, but there are real world examples, and you might be a little bit skeptical. But again, real world examples. If we look at the Trump administration, lots of women, I mean, obviously they weren't the dominant gender in the Trump administration, but there were a fair few women who did fairly abominable things. And this is a group, again, on women in business, right? So I think I won't be amiss in saying that most of you probably agree that a lot of them had fairly twisted ethics, right? So there are examples there. On the other hand, good people sometimes do end up in power. If we look at, for instance, Alexandria Ocasio, I forget her middle name, AOC, right? Bernie. But that's when the community itself is given enough power to put them there and has the right mindset to not select for people who simply carry a big stick and defend them particularly, their particular little group. But there's not a reliable solution yet. We don't have ways to reliably get people who are motivated by genuinely wanting to help maintain the common good in power. And if you have ideas, any of you, work on them, share them. This is an important area, very important. Perhaps just as important as things like, fighting climate change. We can't get there unless we have people who actually want to do what's needed in the first place, right? In power. Now, because those who hold positions of power, especially significant power, comprise a small segment of the population, selection bias applies very strongly. They are, it's a very small portion, right? And it takes a lot of effort to get there. So you're going to get strong selection there. Now, women may be generally more attuned to and supportive of human rights. And I believe I've seen a study on that said that they are statistically more likely to support human rights measures, equality measures, stuff like that. But women who seek power and have the ability to attain power might not necessarily, as a group, again, we're talking statistically here, be any better than the men who seek to attain power because that selection bias is so strong. Now, I don't have statistics on this. This is something that perhaps should be researched. So this is, for now, spitballing. But we shouldn't turn a blind eye. Maybe it's not. Look at the Trump administration, look at boards of directors of companies. A fair few of them do have women on their boards. And still, the behavior's the same. Not across the board. And again, we're talking statistically, and that's important to remember. We shouldn't turn a blind eye to powerful people just because they are from an oppressed minority population. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to get oppressed minority populations in positions of power in the first place. And we shouldn't, try to give them equality in equity, right? I think we should, but we shouldn't turn a blind eye to those who are in positions of power and behave unethically because they are like us or otherwise fall into some group that we relate to, right? We need better standards across the board for everyone. We're not doing a great job of keeping people with unethical tendencies out of power at the moment. We need to work on it. And women, again, tend to be more liberal, tend to be more supportive of human rights and so forth in bulk. So how about we use our collective power to keep those in power in line? We have to be active in sociopolitical matters, right? We can't just sit by. If we do, even if we have good viewpoints on everything, nothing's going to change. We need to be active. And movements tend to tire out, and that's a problem. We can't stop halfway. And we need to think critically as well. It's a major deficit in the general population, critical thinking skills, and especially applying them across the board. Now, let's see, one other thing. Right, and of course, advocate for human rights where possible, and of course, equality in the workplace and positions of power. Now, we as humans settle when a bit of progress is made on a group scale. Some of you might not. I don't think I do, but a lot of us do. If we take, for instance, single-use plastics, there are a number of places, number of corporations, and so forth, entities generally, that reduced production of or produced alternatives to or banned the use of single-use plastics. And people took that as a great stride in fighting for environmental rights. And it is an important stride, but it's not the most critical one at the moment. It doesn't contribute too much to global warming. We need to tackle that one. And now, that might seem fine at first, but there are other examples too, and I'm going to show you a pattern here. Greenwashing. Generally, when companies do whatever they can to make their products, even if they're not environmentally friendly, seem environmentally friendly with small tokenism measures, right? Things that don't actually help very much, but they appear good on paper. And when people see that, they turn a blind eye to everything the company is doing. And this also applies to countries. Got rainbow washing in terms of LGBTQ stuff. Same deal. Just sending out a message on Twitter saying we support you is not going to do much. Another example, Walmart. They used to have painted on their walls the fact that they gave a couple million a year or something trivial like that, charity. That's nothing compared to the rest of their profit, but people looked at them as a better company for it. The workers' rights movement. After we got the 8-hour workday and some other measures, it slipped back. Right. These days, it's nearly impossible to unionize in most industries. There are laws against it in a lot of places. We've gone backwards significantly because a little bit of progress was made and we tired out. And propaganda didn't help. The Paris Climate Change Agreement. That's another one. That's not enough. We need to do more. But a lot of people think when countries actually step up to the plate and get in line with the agreement, but not much further, oh, that's good. That's progress. And it is, but we can't stop there. We have to still keep pushing, even if it's tiring, because otherwise you get wiped out, basically. And one more example here. MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. He said, and I agree with him, that the current institutions tend to take revolutionary figures and vulgarize them, basically make them meaningless by promoting them in contexts that don't actually line up with what they really believed or which are so trivial that over time, the revolutionary nature fades from the public perception. And people still, a company, say, sends out a tweet about MLK Day, and people will settle for that instead of bigger changes that need to be made, right? one step forward, one step back is not progress. And one step forward, two steps back especially isn't progress. So what can we do? In politics, reform is definitely possible. We have ranked choice voting as a possibility. Fighting to remove lobbying, that's an important one. It's basically bribery. Reform the Electoral College, ban gerrymandering. There are more options too, and we should probably get working on all of them. Individually, they can cause things to slip back over time if they're left in. In business, it's important to prioritize ethics over profit where possible, and we need to get rid of the cycle of escalating growth demands resulting from stock prices. Now, on the subject of the last note that I made, business and prioritizing ethics where possible, as a general rule, if you find yourself selecting people or policies that are unethical to maintain a profit or to maintain some kind of power, perhaps we need to rethink what that role really should be. And if you're getting people to do unethical things, maybe you need to rethink what you're doing in the first place, right? And I'm not necessarily saying you individually, I'm saying society writ large needs to rethink our values if we're putting people who do unethical things in positions of power. So if you, men and women alike, find yourself in a position of power, even on a small scale, even in a small business, say, prioritize selecting ethically minded people over those who are most charismatic, where possible and prudent, of course. And this is important. Try to be aware of your own biases and actively work on honestly and objectively criticizing views that you hold. We need a cultural shift towards intellectual honesty with the self. Now, try to pass these thoughts on. Again, preaching to the choir versus preaching to those who maybe will change their minds with time or with some education, right? If anything will fix our present situation, and this is the only thing that'll fix our present situation, it's a culture change. And those come from the grassroots up, not top down. Though, of course, promoting them from the top down does help, but it's grassroots. Remember that. So your contributions, big or small, are meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis. You introduced a number of interesting nuances, I'll say, that I definitely want to kind of call out and explore a little bit, if that sounds reasonable.
Sure.
In particular, we as humans settle with when a little bit of progress is made, which is very key. Likewise, we must not settle for a little bit of progress, as you emphasized. The dynamic between ethics and profit, a very, very key one, of course. And I really appreciate the nuance that you attached to that when you said where possible and prudent. So I think that really brings in a very, very significant aspect. And then
there are cases where unethical decisions have to be made, right? Like somebody invade your country, of course you're going to fight back. So there's a sliding scale. Yeah.
Well said. Well said. And then you pulled it all together with really, I think, one key word I'm going to say, and I want to explore that key word, and then the theme, if you will, the key word being awareness. We've got to be aware of ourselves in order to have some of these fruitful impacts. Yeah. One would say, right, being self-aware, more self-aware versus less self-aware is a degree of maturity that one has to achieve in life's journey.
Yes.
So I really want to hone in on. Well said. I really want to hone in on awareness. And then one other thing I want to kind of throw in there and have you sort of talk to a little bit. So one is awareness. And the other one is, and I truly think this is the arching sort of wrapper, is a cultural shift toward intellectual honesty with the self. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I think one cannot be intellectually honest outside the self, right? Unless one is able to recognize what one's real motivations are and where one is being logically inconsistent, right? Consistency in the mathematical sense is important. If you're going to understand the world around you, you need to make sure that your internal logic matches up. There have been recent studies over the past 3 or 4 years that show that people are remarkably good at believing things that are fundamentally logically inconsistent with other things they believe. And this especially happens with matters that we take on faith or otherwise on an emotional level, right? When there is when we have a strongly held view and it is challenged, most people tend to respond neurologically with activation of primarily emotional parts of the brain. And this of course, served an evolutionary role at one point, but it's not so beneficial in a large civilization. And when those emotional parts of the brain light up, they've found that the logical processing just shuts down. You can't think clearly if you cannot set the emotions aside consciously. You have to do it consciously. Working on mindfulness is important. It might be worth, and I think everybody should do this, taking a course in dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a general mindfulness practice. It's a gold standard for certain types of mental health issues, but it's much more broadly applicable. And I think learning this helps one engage in more intellectual honesty with the self too.
Definitively, and as you kind of think about awareness, if you will, and I'm going to ask for your gut view, if you will, relative to the next few questions. And in particular, I think you and I've mentioned this to you offline and in other situations. I think you bring a very unique perspective to the world, particularly from I'll say the generational vantage point through which you view the world today, very specifically. But if you look at the landscape in general, and we're talking general terms, what percentage of people are truly aware to the degree that you are encouraging the community to aspire to?
Very, very few. I would say it's probably less than 2 or 3%. Now, there are a lot of people who are definitely good people, and I would like to emphasize, most people are decent people and have been affected by circumstances. And circumstances, let me tell you from experience, can do a lot of damage. Most people fundamentally, at some level, want to do the right thing, and they get very, very confused as to what that right thing is. And even on whatever side you are on, there are a lot of people who perhaps have the right views, and I'm not going to try to make judgment calls here, but perhaps have the right views, but hold them for reasons that are not quite right and are not so good at checking when they've gone a little bit too far. And that, I think, is where a lot of people fail, is the figuring out when their views, which are fun, at a level of basic ethics, like, do I want to make people happier in general? They're probably going to be fine. Like, yes, they want to make people happier in general, communally, right? But the way they apply it gets a little iffy.
So as you kind of consider that, and definitively, there's no judgment here. It's an exploration, really, I think, of human nature, quite honestly, more than anything else.
Definitely.
As you look at the place that we find ourselves in terms of the cultural shift toward intellectual honesty with the self, the question that comes to my mind very openly is: are we too comfortable? Have our technological advances, made us so comfortable that we don't challenge ourselves anymore?
Absolutely. Yeah.
To the point, I'm almost on the verge of saying we're probably a little bit lazy at times.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I'm going to sort of take some pot shots at America here for a moment. In America, our protests tend to be fairly small, and we don't protest comparatively, right? And we don't protest as often for as long as other countries. If you look at France, for example, they protest when something needs to change. And now, it's important to remember there are socioeconomic factors. In the US, it is quite hard to get the time to protest. And there's some very problematic tactics being used by law enforcement at the moment, but that's besides the point. It's not besides the point, but it's a lesser issue. People have gotten attached to the things they have, understandably, and tend to prioritize keeping the things they have over improving the situation in the long term. I think we've gotten into a very short-term mentality. I think that's the big issue here, is a very, very short-term mentality. I don't think our technology has helped. We did not evolve for the technology. And I'm not saying we should get rid of it. I'm saying we need to rethink how we relate to it. And now, I'm very much a left-wing person, but echo chambers are a thing. And whichever side you're on, look at the other side. Do they have echo chambers? Perhaps you might too. And then there's our education systems don't help. We're not taught basic emotional management skills, things that a lot of people learn in therapy, but most people never learn to begin with. We don't learn to cope with intergenerational trauma, which definitely clouds our thinking and behavior in the very long term. It changes so much about us. And then, where was the last point? I forget what my last point was. Let me think for a second here. So it was, I lost it.
All good. All good. In reflecting on kind of all those aspects, Alexis, if you have one suggestion for, as you look forward into, if you will, and for future generations, one suggestion that we can act on today, what would that suggestion be, my friend?
Let me think about that for a second here. So, one suggestion. We need to recognize our fallibility as a species. We need to be able to recognize that there are things we do very poorly, and we need to be willing to do what we can to change them, of course, in as ethical a manner as possible while looking at the long term. And it sounds abstract, but more or less what I'm saying is, if we're relating to something poorly, like our technology, we need to recognize that. And we need to be vocal about it, and we can't stop until it's changed. And we can't completely stop when it's changed either, right? Maintenance is important.
Definitively returning us to the whole aspect of awareness and mindfulness and what have you around how we relate to the world around us and relate to one another, quite honestly. Well, I definitely want to respect your time, my good friend here. Any sort of closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, by all means.
I mean, if you want to go for longer, I have nothing planned for the next 30 minutes. So, but
You're very kind. You're very
closing
kind.
thoughts.
Or things, if you have a little bit more time, definitively. I mean, things that you would you want to venture a little bit more deeper into. I mean, I think you've introduced some very, very key pillars. The ethics profit equation is a very interesting one. With awareness and mindfulness bringing that balance in.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. All right. I'm going to go a little bit off the beaten trail here into stuff that might seem a little bit out there. The thoughts have been around for a long time, though. The civilization collectively behaves in some ways like a large organism, right? And the problem is our civilization as an organism, right, did not evolve. It coalesced from a bunch of creatures which had evolved for smaller types of organization with vastly different circumstances without any of the technology, right? Or very little of the technology. And because of this, our organization is extremely poor. It's very chaotic. There's a lot of duplication of effort. There's a lot of hoarding of resources, and feuding and not recognizing the mutual damage done by that. And on that note, very few long-term conflicts have a good side. Perhaps someone started it, yes. And there is a justification for being angry if you're on the side that received the starting blow, right? But getting a large-scale conflict going inevitably leads, and regardless of who's right, who's wrong, killing or otherwise injuring at a physical, economic, social level, the other side is going to cause damage for everyone in the long term, and it's going to be extremely hard to stop. It's going to drag on for a long time. It's not productive. And I think we need to start recognizing the fact that we are more or less all in it together. This is one big collective thing, and if it doesn't work globally, it's going to screw everything over locally.
And specifically around the evolutionary aspect, and evolution being grounded again in awareness. I mean, if I look at the respectfully, my daughter, who's in her mid-20s at this point, and both helping her and her helping me of a different generation, I'll put it that way, become more aware. How and I know the techniques and the thoughts that I use and how she interacts with me. What are the kinds of things that you would encourage us to do with one another as human beings to cause that awareness and that evolution to move in a more healthy direction?
Listen, like really listen, right? When you find yourself in a situation that is emotionally stressful, especially if it's emotionally stressful because of something that someone else is doing, someone else is saying, perhaps you disagree with them strongly, listen. Don't, in your head, don't think up counter arguments, don't think up responses until they've completed their thought. Listen. If you go into that mode where you're thinking up responses as they go, you won't hear everything they say. And sometimes you will miss things, or something is so far into what they're going to say that if you stop them, you will never hear their full perspective. And my parents, they had issues that dragged on for years, and if they had ever let each other finish their sentences, or their thoughts, they would have resolved themselves, right? I think a lot of people have seen this pattern. So listen, that's extremely important. And try to be aware of the other factors that might be in someone else's past or their present situation. Environment is incredibly important to behavior. We cannot think of ourselves as completely isolated from the environment. We are a product of the environment, and that does not absolve us of all, responsibility for actions by any means. But we are products of the environment. We can be changed with a new environment, and that's important to remember too. And finally, to promote the ideas of basically free education as an adjunct to normal education in DBT, education on intergenerational trauma, and some other basically basic education in mindfulness and being able to recognize where the past has impacted you or others, and then being able to empathize with that. I think education on that is incredibly important. And if people go out and start advocating for it, it will make an impact, not in the next 2 years, but it'll make an impact in the next 10, a big one.
Thank you, Alexis, for that elaboration. It's powerful to think in terms of awareness, both of ourselves, like you expressed, of others, and being listening, if you will, and being aware of others, and truly taking that, as well as our context. So awareness of ourselves, others, our context, and there's two pieces that you really called out. I would love for you to elaborate on, which you've called out a couple of times, actually, very, very crucial to all of this, is really the notions of stress and trauma, the roles that stress has and the role that trauma plays into it. Any thoughts that you'd like to share around specifically those two aspects, because they are very rich?
Sure. So I'll start with maladaptive coping tools. If you grew up in or perhaps even spent a long time as an adult, in a situation that was problematic, had a not necessarily even fully traumatic dynamic, but a dysfunctional dynamic, you will most likely have picked up coping tools that actually did have a function in context in the original situation, right? They did have a function that did help you in one way or another survive or maintain a reasonable state of mind. But we often take those tools and apply them in the next context. And when we do that, if they're maladaptive, we're not using the right tool for the job. We're using a tool that might be drastically overkill. And I think, so that's an important one. Let's see. There's a series of, it's a classification system basically for childhood trauma, the ACEs system. And they have found in large studies that people who have a high number of these ACEs, that is adverse childhood experiences, like perhaps a parent who had a severe mental health issue, went to prison, a mother who got physically assaulted by someone in the home, verbal abuse happening to the child, etc., right? Those people tend to have drastically worse physical health outcomes and mental health outcomes. And this spills over into things like much higher likelihood of engaging in drug use later on, lots of other things. And of course, passing on that trauma. And that doesn't happen in all cases, but it happens in enough that we keep getting trauma from generation to generation at much higher rates than are really necessary. And let's see. So now on to stress and its relation to trauma too. We'll start with PTSD. PTSD is basically an elevated stress response that lasts for a very extended period of time. And of course, you try to avoid the things that cause it to get even worse, right? But it's an elevated stress response. And stress, going back to the ACEs, also causes a lot of those symptoms. And interferes with our ability to process things logically. We tend to be more emotional, right, when we're very stressed. And it's important to remember, people across the globe, a lot of us are in incredibly stressful situations on a very consistent basis, or perhaps have been our entire lives. So being aware of the fact that other people may have been through absolute hell and may want to do the right thing, but might not be thinking clearly, is important. I'm not saying treat them as completely irresponsible for their actions, right? I'm saying if someone does something that is unethical, damaging, whatever, we can condemn their actions without condemning them as a person. And we can recognize that they may have the ability to grow. And if we treat them as a human being who may have the ability to grow, we can de-escalate and perhaps get them to stop doing those negative things. De-escalation is important. And yes, in some cases, it is more efficient to just arrest or shoot someone or whatever, right? Or to block someone on a much less violent level, right? Kick them out of your social circle. Yes, in some cases, it's necessary. But it's not the only tool we have. And it's actually, it makes things so much worse in a lot of cases. If it's not used prudently, it makes things vastly worse.
Thank you, Alexis, again for the elaboration. It's you know what a lot of if I'm taking in the whole conversation, if you will, from beginning to end, and it really begins to boil down to, be aware, integrate things, achieve a higher degree of maturity just to be the best human being you can be with yourself and with others, quite fundamentally.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Our species is immature. It's definitely true. And there's a reason for that. First off, our species as a whole has undergone huge amounts of stress over its existence, right? We came from a world in which survival meant, basically sleeping in huts for a lifetime, running from wild game, fighting other tribes that needed resources, so they attacked you, right? So that's where things sort of started. right? Ignoring the evolutionary context even. So those people are stressed out, right? Then they get agriculture, and you have all sorts of other stresses that are up there. Big increases in population density. So now you've got more people than you can manage socially, very different social dynamics. That causes stress. That causes people to start snapping, to stop behaving rationally. And of course, it goes on and on and on. And until quite recently, the last century or so, we haven't really had much awareness of psychology at all. It's a new field, and it's still very much in its infancy. It's quite imprecise at the moment, and I think it will get more precise as we start applying artificial intelligence to it, but we're not there yet. And so that's I think where this all comes from, and we as a culture, if we want to stop doing things that hurt everybody, need to be able to engage in the same skills that you use in a dysfunctional family, right? So you have to be more mature as a civilization if you want those dynamics to stop.
Well said. Definitively, the macrocosm is a magnification of the microcosm, and likewise in reverse that relationship. So my good friend, before we sign off, I kind of come back to sort of, any sort of parting messages for the conference, the event, leaders in the world, across the board, and just for us individually, sort of parting, closing thoughts.
Let's see. Look at the larger context. That's always important. If you think you know something, keep thinking. You probably don't know it perfectly. There's very, very little that we know perfectly. Perhaps mathematics, right? So there's always more nuance that could be gained, and it's important to be aware that our perceptions might not reflect reality perfectly.
Well said. Well said. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. Tremendously appreciate you making the time, and tremendously looking forward to some incredible conversations on May 13th with all the folks that are participating on the panels and the keynotes and what have you, with definitively the involvement of the Women Business Collaborative and of course Andy Simon. And we'll look forward to some great conversations. And thank you again, Alexis.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.